Most people agree that liberty is something important, but what is liberty? You are not free if you are forced to pick cotton day after day, but you are still free if you are forced to work for a boss and rent from a landlord because you cannot have a piece of land where you can run your own business or build your own home. Geoism is the recognition that people have equal rights to what nature provides for free, such as land. Geoism gives us a framework for building a better society with both freedom and equality. Not only can houses be affordable, but people can also have much more freedom to choose their own lifestyle. In this podcast, we explore the friendliest flavor of liberty. Welcome to the second episode of this podcast about the finest taste of liberty. In the first episode, Gareth and I introduced you to Geoism. Geoism can be discussed from many different perspectives. Today, we introduce you to Geoist economics. How might the economy work if we recognize that people have equal rights to land and other natural resources? How would a Geoist economy affect our lives? And what is the difference between mainstream economics and Geoist economics? And you will learn that Geoist economics used to be mainstream. Gareth, thank you for joining me again.
Okay, good morning, Barend. Thank you for having me on again.
Gareth, could you give our listeners a brief summary of the roots of Geoism?
So you mentioned there one of the key highlights for you is that we have equal rights to land and all that nature provides. We can go back to an even deeper root than that, which is an acknowledgement that there's a fundamental difference between that which nature provides and the things we make and do ourselves. So in a way, everything comes from that recognition, and you can come out to that to rights as you do. You can come out to it as to what works in society, what's the most efficient way of having life, how society work for everybody. Now, all of those kind of thoughts came to then a complete economic model that was first put together by Henry George, but its roots go much further back and it's been refined since then. So we have this complete economic model, and then out of that model we have then, well, what actions can be taken that are congruent with that model, such that we get the outcomes that we want, a fairer society, a society that works for everybody. So one example for that is, for instance, conventional takeaway from Geoist economics is that LVT should be used, land value tax, and of course wherever the principle always is that land value tax replaces other taxation. So this is not a matter of more tax, but it's a matter of a shift in taxation such that things work better.
Yes, that is something very important. Most Geoists are in favor of a land value tax, but it should not just be an additional form of taxation. It should replace other taxes, or the revenue should be returned as basic income. If we do that, people who do not own too much land can pay their land value tax out of their basic income. Land value tax should make land more accessible to ordinary people, and that would allow them to own their own house or have their own workshop. Similarly, Geoists think it's wrong that a few big companies burn huge amounts of fossil fuels while some individuals can barely afford to heat their homes. And the right level of land value tax would reflect the rent, or the value of the privilege of using the natural resource.
One of the fun things that for me, talking about rent and availability of land, is if you think of a car, you either buy a car or you hire a car. If you hire a car, if you pay rent on a car, you don't have to pay a big lump sum, and the same would occur with land. It's not that we need to hire or that we rent land from someone else, but if we pay that rent on land, then the value of the asset value of the land evaporates. So land is basically free then to acquire, but you pay on an ongoing basis for its use.
Yes, I think that was a nice transition to the next thing to discuss, which is how people would experience a Geoist economy. And one of the things that would be very different in a Geoist society would be buying and owning a house. How would that work in a Geoist society? I think the most obvious change would be that if you bought a piece of land with a house on it, you would only be paying the previous owner for the house itself, not for the land underneath the house. The purchase price for the land would be about zero. You would still pay for the land, but that would be the payment of rent or land value tax. You would pay this every month, for example. This land value tax would be equal to the rental value of the land if it would be unimproved, if it were just a piece of land overgrown with weeds. This land rent plays an important role in Geoist economics.
The absence of payment of rent causes harm, therefore we need to have the payment of rent happen wherever rent occurs. Then and the outcome of that is that there's no asset value to land. Well, then what you're buying from somebody, so if I want to go and buy a house from somebody, I say, well, how much is that house? It is interesting in that because the house is attached to the land, you can't separate the two physically. Again, getting back to that basic principle, there's the things that we've made ourselves or change that we've done to the land that gives it value, and there's also the underlying, that which nature provided in the first place.
Yeah, and I think the most obvious thing would be, and that's what you already mentioned earlier, that when people need to pay a land value tax, that as a result the land price will drop until almost zero. So when I buy your house, I will only pay for the bricks and the windows and the doors for the house itself, and not for the land below your house. And I still will pay for the land, for my garden, for the location where my house is on, but that will be the land value tax. And that land value tax can be used to eliminate other taxes, but it can also be returned to the people as a basic income. And in that situation, I could pay my land value tax if I have a normal home with not a very big garden or so. I could pay exactly my land value tax from my basic income.
Yes, absolutely. There's what can be done with the rent just opens another whole series of discussions. And of course the traditional thing, and probably the first priority in most ways of transition, is to eliminate the taxes that cause harm. Taxes on income, taxes on, like we discussed in the last episode, these things that are harmful to an economy and harmful to the people in the society who are subjected to these taxes. And there's the idea of universal income or citizen dividend, these kind of ideas as well. But if we could get back as well, just to round off what we were saying about the transfer, absolutely. You say we buy the house, but we rent the land. So how would that work? I mean, if the house I'm in would go up for sale, and it was just the cost of the bricks and mortar, then 500 people would say, hey, I want to buy that. Everybody would want to buy it because it's really cheap. But where it is what makes it valuable for people. That's what's attractive to people, is the services that the public services available, the fact that it's near Frankfurt, which means that there's lots of opportunities to work, the fact that it's in a beautiful region, the Odenwald Mountains are on our doorstep. So if a surveyor says, well, it's worth however many €1,000, then how do we decide which of all the people who would pay that for it actually gets to buy it from us? And this is where a concept, something like a land value auction, can occur, where people are not bidding as today's auction. They're bidding how much they're going to pay as a one-off payment, but they're bidding how much would I be willing to pay on an ongoing basis to buy that house in that location. And in that way you can use the market to find out what is the ongoing rent value for the land on which this house sits. And the person who wins that auction is the one who gets to buy the house from us.
Okay, yeah. So buying a house would be much easier, especially for the people who today can hardly find a place to live. The next example, which is maybe even a little bit less complicated than the house market, is the market in agricultural land. What would that look like? Now, the unimproved value of land, that's what determines the land value tax. And the improvements are what people pay for if they buy something. So if a house is on land, people will pay for the house. Agricultural land can be improved, so the value of agricultural land can be higher than the unimproved value of land, but usually the unimproved value will be relatively close to the improved value of agricultural land. And that means that agricultural land will not have a very high market price. So if I would like to start my own farm, I don't need to collect millions of euros to buy some land, because I can buy land for a price very close to zero. Maybe for some thousands of euros I can already buy some agricultural land. However, I will still pay the land value tax, and that will be a serious amount if I want to start a larger farm. And that means that if I want to run a large farm, that I need to do it in an efficient way. I cannot hoard agricultural land and collect enormous amounts of agricultural land and hardly use it. I can only pay my land value tax if I use the land in an efficient way. And I think zoning laws could be one of the ways to limit the efficiency of agriculture, because you can imagine that if you use land in the most efficient way, that may not be the best way of using it for nature. So that's another thing. We will discuss that in a different episode.
Can I add something into that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think you described that beautifully. The impact and the availability of land for people who want to run their own farms, to live the farming lifestyle, which is what it more used to be than a intensive business. Although there's also room for that, but there's room to do both, as long as it's fair and everybody is paying the rent on the land. But the interesting thing you brought in there was, I think, worth mentioning is zoning laws. Now, where do zoning laws, because the partially to an extent, a lot of people are really frustrated by zoning laws or planning permission, because the concept of land ownership we have these days is, well, it's mine, I should be able to do what I want with it. On the other hand, it doesn't make sense that community says, yeah, sure, you can pollute that land, you can destroy that land, or you can build a block of houses in a completely inappropriate place. So this comes out, I just wanted to take it back to the root again. One of the other things that comes out of the fundamental difference between what we make and do ourselves and that which nature provides is that with what nature provides, we can't just do what we want with it. Sure, we need to pay rent on it, we're covering that, but we also need to acknowledge that the community has a say in how and in what we do with nature that we take stewardship of, or that we own, such that we pay rent on it.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, so community can decide that on some agricultural land nature should also be preserved, and that the production therefore will be relatively low. Then the land value tax will also be much lower than for agricultural land, where you can produce however you want in the most efficient way and don't need to take care about nature.
That's a gorgeous way of tying those two things, that yes, we pay rent, and yes, the community has a say. This is what Geoists say is different about land and natural resources and the things that we make and do ourselves.
Yeah, so I think the next topic could be burning fossil fuels. What would that look like? So today we have the problem that some people, and especially some very large companies, burn enormous amounts of fossil fuels, what would that look like in a Geoist society? Geoists think that people have equal rights to what nature provides for free. So people have equal rights to burn fossil fuels. But Geoism is, I think by definition, also a sustainable form of economy. So I think that people should not burn more fossil fuels than what is possible in a sustainable way. And I think the simplest way to organize that is quite similar to the land value tax, is something like a land value tax on the extraction of fossil fuels. And the revenues of that taxation can be used in the same way as the land value tax. So, or it can be shared equally as a basic income, or it can be used to eliminate other taxes.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the common counter arguments to the high tax on extraction of fossil fuels is that it makes many things more expensive. And if we have a situation, if we have an economy where there is poverty, we're going to make it an even worse extreme of poverty. However, this is to me why you can't separate the climate issue from the land issue, because solving the land issue, having rent paid comprehensively on all land, solves, as we mentioned in the last podcast, it solves poverty and unemployment and low wages. So if we've solved that by dealing with land, and then we solve the climate by having appropriate taxation on fossil fuels to restrict the extraction to sustainable levels, that can be done without people being deprived of some basic things that depend on oil. So it's this balance that we're looking to introduce with this principled approach to transitioning our economy.
Yes, and I think we should still address one concern: carbon emissions and the surveillance state. Some people are concerned about governments that want to monitor everything we do in order to reduce carbon emissions. And in my country, something like that is already happening. Companies are forced by the government to register how their employees travel and how much carbon they emit. And this is not only an increase in bureaucracy, but it also brings concerns about privacy. And it is completely unnecessary. Only a limited number of companies extract fossil fuels. Just taxing the extraction of fossil fuels or auctioning the rights to extract them would be sufficient. Geoists are not in favor of a surveillance state that monitors our behavior. The next thing to discuss is what it would be to start or run your own business. And I think in a Geoist society it would be much easier. And the main reason would be a much simpler kind of tax system. You only need to pay a land value tax, and other taxes will be eliminated, so you don't need to be a very big expert on tax regulation to be able to run a business or to hire employees, and you don't need to be very afraid to get in trouble with the government if you do something wrong, because the land value tax is a very simple and clear kind of system. And I think it's important that if you need some land for a business, for instance a workshop, that it will be much easier to find one. You don't need to collect an enormous amount of money to be able to buy the land that you need to run your business. So what do you think about it, Gareth? How do you think it would be to run a business in a Geoist society?
I think the 2 points you make, one about that the financial cost of taxation, and the second about the bureaucratic cost of taxation, are really big. And what's interesting to me, or one of the interesting things to me, is that the way in which taking these things, eliminating these overheads for businesses is different in, for instance, in the middle of an industrial or commercial high rent city, or in the margins. So if we take the margins first, what we mean by the margins are the places where it's barely viable these days to run a business. When you take away those additional burdens, taxation burdens from there, suddenly those deprived regions can thrive, because it is worthwhile for someone to take a workshop that it might not have cost very much to buy, but where when you start a business, the cost of the taxation, the percentages on each sale, the percentages on every payment you make to your employees, the percentage that's taken from profit, all of that means that you couldn't survive. Whereas in a Geoist society you can, especially where those regions are also poor, because land is preventing, or the land issue is preventing people from being able to earn decently. On the other hand, in the middle of the cities, in the most thriving places, one of the problems we have today is that businesses who've owned their lands for centuries, or for decades even, they don't have to be competitive. So they undermine businesses where business owners are paying rent on the land underneath their premises, because they are paying the full true cost of running a business in that city, whereas their competitors are getting away with they don't have to be competitive because they're not having to pay the rent. So it makes an equal playing field and a more dynamic economy and a more efficient economy, and that benefits everyone.
So some people will still work for a boss, also in a Jewish society. We don't think that every person on earth should be an independent worker. It can be very efficient, and some people really like it to work together in a bigger kind of company. One of the results of a Jewish economy for people who earn wages will be that their wages will probably go up. Most Jewish economists believe that wages will be higher in a Jewish society.
Yep, wages higher, better working conditions, workers in a stronger negotiating position, because you always have the option of going to work for yourself. Then, as we spoke in the last podcast, when people have the option to do otherwise, a reasonable option to earn for themselves, then the employer has to offer more favourable wages and working conditions and terms of employment. And this takes us to, how does that work? What's the economic underpinning? It's not just that Geoist economists believe they would be higher. The economic model tells us that is an inevitable outcome.
Yes, yeah. So this might be a nice moment to discuss the economic model of Geoism. And I think the most important thing is that Geoists think it's very important to distinguish between land and capital, and mainstream economists put land and capital together as capital. I think that might be the main difference between these two kinds of economy.
Absolutely, that's the starting point. If you're absent that differentiation, again, it's going back to the roots. We're talking about recognizing the fundamental difference between that which nature provides and that which we make and do ourselves. And these terms, land, which in economics or in classical economics means land and everything that nature provides. We just use land as a shortcut for that, and the things that we make and do ourselves. So if you don't start with the absolute fundamental distinction between these two things, then you're building your economic principles on sand.
Yeah. Let's discuss the three different factors of production very briefly. So the first one is labor, and I think labor is working. So if I have some time and I use it to work for myself or for a boss, that's my labor, and I can use my brain or I can use my muscles, I can do things. And as a result of labor, I can produce things for myself, I can produce things that I sell, or I can receive wages. Is that a good description of labor?
Absolutely. Labor is what we do, what we can make. It's our the resource that is indistinguishable, inseparable from ourselves. So that's the first, and if I then go on, the next one, without which labour can do nothing, without which we can't even stand or exist or breathe, is land. So land is essential for us to live, as we've discussed before, but it's also essential for us to work. We need to work on something. In an agrarian old situation, we work the land with our hands, and that's how we get our inverted commas wages. So land and labour are the two basic components that are necessary for survival.
Yeah, so if I want to produce potatoes, I need to work, I need labor, and I need land, because I cannot grow potatoes without using some land. And I can do that with my bare hands, and then I only need some seed potatoes, land, and my labor. But it would be more efficient if I have some tools. And I think that's the third factor of production, capital. And that capital can be very simple, but it could also be much more sophisticated equipment to grow potatoes extremely efficiently. And that's capital. There are also different ways to define capital. When you produce things, you can speak of wealth. And when you use that wealth, the things you produce, to produce even more wealth, or to produce more wealth in a more efficient way, then you can speak of capital.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that with the term capitalism that's used for today's economy is a bit of a misnomer, really, because if they fail to separate land from capital. Capitalism considers the land, the oil, natural resources, it considers it all to be capital, whereas if we separate them out and we say, well, capital is used by labour to get wealth by applying it to land, generally speaking, then it changes the whole discourse around, well, what does a society need, a poor society need to thrive, to develop, to make a better quality of life for people. There's this assumption that we need, or our country needs capital, otherwise blah blah blah. Well, no. In the first instance, all we need is labour and land. It's the absence of access to land which is the key to unlocking this economic model. Where it goes wrong is if a small number of people have a monopoly over most of the land and natural resources, and then that wealth and consequently the capital and the control goes to a small number of people.
Okay, the next things to discuss are scarcity, privilege and rent. Scarcity only occurs when more than one person wants to use a natural resource, such as a piece of land. If no one else wants to use a natural resource, I can just take it for free. But as soon as two or more people want to use, say, a piece of land or a place to moor a boat, scarcity arises. Spatial planning can create artificial scarcity, for example of land on which we can build houses or places to moor our boats. If governments make it illegal to build houses or moor boats on some locations, more scarcity will occur. The person who gets the right to use a piece of land, for example, has a privilege. That person can use that unique piece of land while other people can't. And that privilege has a value. The value of that privilege is called rent. Rent can be for the privilege of using a piece of land, but if the amount of fossil fuels that can be burned is limited, something similar can happen.
Yes, and maybe an easier example for which is a parallel, which is similar. The carbon dioxide is such a big topic that sometimes people find it hard to get their heads around. But if you imagine a water well or a village with a single water well, now if that water well just has a certain amount of water, and the village is not taking it all every day, there is no rent. If we get to a situation where the village wants more water than there is available, then rent arises. And in a world where we've got the land sorted and there isn't poverty, you can use the market to determine what that rent level is and make sure that the water doesn't run out, where we can add another level of complexity of that, which is the case in most scenarios today, whereas that water in the well isn't exclusively used by that village, but it's a water table that is shared by many villages, or it's a river that serves many communities further downstream. So then it's not just wanting sufficient rent to stop it from running out for them. We need to determine what is the maximum sustainable draw for that well that doesn't negatively impact not only their own community but other communities further downstream, or other communities that share the same water table. And so you determine what that is, and the rent level then determines what is the maximum draw.
Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm. So rent can be about all different kinds of natural resources. I think about everything that nature provides for free. Rent occurs when there is some degree of scarcity, so when more than one person wants to use the natural resource, or when people together want to use more of it than they can do in a sustainable way. And Geoists have some kind of opinion about what should happen to rent, because they think that rent should be collected and in some way divided equally. And dividing rent equally can be done by sharing it as a basic income. Then that basic income can be used by every individual to get their share of the natural resources, but it could also be used to eliminate other taxes, and the result would be probably rather similar.
Yeah, one of the interesting things these days is there's a huge amount of research going into basic income, universal income, and a lot of the old assumptions that it will cause people to be lazy, or it will people having free money will mean that employers pay less, or there's lots of old reasons that people didn't want a universal income. But the experiments, and there's a lot of pilots out there these days, and virtually all of them are coming back. Actually, individuals spend their money more effectively, more efficiently, and accomplish more with it than if it is given to a charity or an organisation that decides what the best thing for that community would be. The community individuals are better at spending money than organisations. That said, there are certain things in society, in most societies now, anarchists might disagree on this front, but most people accept that there are certain things in society that we all want and that we think is fair to pay for.
Okay, that sounds like a great economic model, and also a rather simple economic model. So 3 factors of production: labor, land and capital. Who invented it like this? Is it something completely new, Gareth?
Not by any stretch of the imagination. The differentiation between nature and the things we make go back a long way from indigenous populations, and the physiocrats then were reasoning it out. The first model, the formal economic model that is generally recognised was you could say invented or discovered. If you think that there's such a thing as natural law, you can say, well, it was there all the time. It was just up to us to figure out what the relationships were. And Adam Smith was the first to do that. So the 3-factor model comes from him. He recognised that taxation on land is the most efficient form of taxation. But there was a lot more work that needed to be done on that. Then the classical economists then took this 3-factor model and they evolved it. So Ricardo, for instance, he developed the concept of rent a lot further, and then we had John Stuart Mill and a number of other classical economists. The classical economical model then was revived by Henry George and was first expressed comprehensively in his 1879 book Progress and Poverty. He was asking, we covered this a bit in the last in the last podcast, where he was asking the question, how come where there's increase in poverty in progress, that also comes poverty. And he found the answer in the classical economic model, and he went back to the roots and he built it back again. The description of the free market with the distinction between land and capital is gorgeous. It's poetic almost.
Yes, Henry George and Geoists believe that land is something very important. If people can't have any land, it's very hard for them to start their own business if wages are too low, and it is very hard for them to build their own houses if their rents are too high. Okay, that was a quick introduction to Geoist economics. There's a lot more to say or read about it, but I don't want to make this podcast too long. I hope our listeners have been inspired and want to learn more. There are lots of excellent videos on YouTube, for example, or you could read some books. I have a favorite book that introduces Geoist economy, and I have it here. It's Brian Hodgkinson's How Our Economy Really Works. So if listeners are interested, I would recommend them this book. Try to get yourself a copy. Gareth, do you have a favorite book about Geoist economy?
Oh, I actually I have many that I enjoy, but I tend to find weaknesses in all of them, or things that I don't entirely agree with. But actually, my recommendation would be to go to the source. It can be because it was written, as I say, in 1879, so it can be a bit of a tough read. And he wasn't writing from I am writing on the shoulders of giants perspective. He was writing out of frustration and anger at the situation that he had experienced in his lifetime. So it can be a bit of a tough read, but it is also extremely rewarding. And I think when you've finished it, then I would recommend Progress and Poverty, to go back to the beginning and read it again.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So the recommendation is read Progress and Poverty. That's the real stuff. And if you're as lazy as I am, then you could consider getting yourself a copy of it's only, I think, 100 pages or so, of How Our Economy Really Works by Brian Hodgkinson. Okay, have a great day. Bye-bye.
All the best. Bye.
Still there? That's awesome. Please promote this podcast and tell your friends that Geoism is the way to go. My website is geoliberty.nl. Bye.